There's a man going around taking names, and he decides who to free and who to blame. Everybody won't be treated all the same. There'll be a golden ladder reaching down when the man comes around. The hairs on your arms will stand up, and the terror in each sip and in each sup. Will you partake of that last offered cup, or disappear into the potter's ground when the man comes around? Whoever is unjust, let him be unjust still. Whoever is righteous, let him be righteous still. Whoever is filthy, let him be filthy still. Listen to the words long written down when the man comes around. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts saying, "Come and see." And I behold a white horse, and the name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. My favorite part of that section of the Bible, from the book of Revelation, when they're introducing the four horsemen, is the part where like it's all this badass metal shit. Like, oh my God, like the guy's got a sword and he's slaying a quarter of the earth or whatever. And then they get to famine, and it's like he's got a balance, and he's making sure that you know the correct price of he's basically doing a price check at Piggly Wiggly in the middle of the apocalypse. He's like, and don't forget, it's a penny for a rod of wheat or whatever the fuck. It's like, I'm sorry, there's guys with like giant swords and sickles, and they're destroying half of the price of the earth. Could we talk about this later, maybe? But that's the thing about famine, is it's not really about food, it's about money. It's about affording it, not whether it exists. And so, at the end of line, I think that's a good reminder. That guy from that horseman in his introduction, that when the end comes, whatever end you're fantasizing, there's still going to be somebody there with a fucking price gun. You're still going to have to pay for it. It's not going to be. It's not going to be some carnival free-for-all where all of the established structures that have bound you in life have fallen away. No, those are going to hang on till the bitter fucking end. I was looking for that quote again. The whole thing. Yes. And I saw another horse that was red, and the power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another. And there was given unto him a great sword. That's badass. That's fucking metal. And when he opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, "Come and see." And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. Wait a minute, what? Balances? And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, "A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine." Oh, cool. That's badass. But then he opened the fourth seal, and I heard a voice of the fourth beast say, "Come and see." And I looked and beheld a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him, and power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. I never get how you're supposed to kill with death. Like, you kill with hunger, kill with war. How do you kill with death? Like, the concept of death? Dumb. I mean, the guy was tripping balls on mushrooms on Patmos. We can't take him too seriously. But, of course, we have to understand it as a metaphor for the end times. And I honestly feel like the Enlightenment and modernity in the West has done a good job of obscuring a fundamental truth, which is that Christianity is and always was, in its original incarnation, in its conception, in its narrative, in its symbolic architecture, is a apocalyptic movement. It is you could call it a death cult, but I think that's honestly negative, too pejorative. But I think that's because the promise of Christianity, its solution to the problem of existence, which the Jews had tackled with their notion of a covenant, of a God who has a particular covenant with them, that was a very effective mechanism, and it was resilient in a way that previous religious traditions just weren't. But then in first century Palestine, it was facing the reality of long-term domination by others, you know? Like, oh, these Romans aren't going anywhere. How are we to live? And Christianity was the answer to that. Christianity was to open the covenant to all. But what that meant was changing your relationship, the way you perceive other people, making all of them members of a family, that's just children of God, everybody. Now, to do that, you either have to be a person who can strip themselves of all earthly desires, of all human connections, to be Christ himself, to be a figure like Christ. Well, we're not Christ. We're fallen. We cannot be him. And so that means that we have to live as humans surrounded by misery, exploitation, injustice, a fundamental alienation between people that occurs when you have a society based on hierarchy of rights and of exploitation of some by others. Like that is the snake in the fucking garden of human events. Is that it's that curdled thing running through all human relationships. It's the domination that defines a social order. And if you're going to have a large number of people embracing Christianity, well, that means living as Christians, and that means abolishing those structures, because they cannot survive true Christian brotherhood. Anything else is something else, and that's what happened when Christianity was absorbed by the Roman Empire. The early Christians attempted to live in common, and they were able to do so, you know, in small areas and temporarily. But Christianity, if it was going to be a lived existence, required either a elevation of spirit or a radically changed social relationship. Because if you're just a regular person, if you aren't touched by God, but you do feel the connection that God represents in you, and you have you are drawn to it, as most of us are, then you will want to live in harmony with others. And if a bunch of people want to live that way, then the social realities, the human nature shit that's supposed to require domination as the basic relationship in a social order, that's dissolved. It's replaced by the fact that you have people who literally don't want to do antisocial things. They don't want to harm one another. They don't want to violate rules because everyone is treating each other like a Christian, i.e., like they're in the description of heaven that God gives, or that Jesus gives, that people imagine when they imagine heaven. Heaven can be made on earth, but only through the destruction of domination. Because a community of people with a shared vocabulary of virtue, not exploiting one another, that is the eschaton. That is the end of the world. That is the end of the world as we know it. That is the next world, the world to come, that is described by Christ. But once Christianity becomes the religion of power, then that apocalypticism, which is, I would argue, a positive apocalypticism, an attempt to reach to redefine, to break the bonds that hold us, to redeem ourselves as members of a species that is fundamentally connected to a biosphere, like to live as to repair the breach that exists between the human individual psyche and the ecosystem that they're part of, which is what all religion seeks to do. But forgetting about what it is turned into and reified culturally, which is, of course, the opposite, because it's put to the use of maintaining social order, which is domination. The instinct, the thing that gets people to create it and follow it when there's no money in it and when there has not been it's not been reified by power, is a real desire to heal that breach. And that early Christian desire is, I can either still live among people and suffer with them, but suffer in the knowledge, that God, that Jesus has redeemed us, and that by believing in him, I will go to heaven. And really believing that, if you really believed it, you could live amongst men. You could turn the other cheek. You could suffer. Or, if you don't have it in you to do that, you can live as Christians, and therefore break reality. Of course, you can't really do that when you have the Roman Empire breathing down your neck, and so you had Christianity's persecution. You have Christianity being a persecuted sect. And when that's the case, when you can't live as brothers, when you're compelled to live under the threat of death in this misery pit, this slave society, well, then you need a story to keep you going. And the story that you got was, this will all be over soon. Your faith will be rewarded in this life. That's the important thing. Because yes, but heaven is shmeven. Heaven gains its, I would argue that heaven is a concept, gains its depth and its emotional resonance and its symbolic power as Christianity becomes more and more connected to power, to reinforcing power, becomes integrated into a power structure. Because life on Earth is increasingly under regimes of power, assumed to continue. That's why we're doing all this, to keep doing it. That's the only reason anyone is in this thing, is the belief that it will advantage them in this life. So you're not going to get the apocalypse in life, and you're not going to overcome the miseries and the sins of humans on this earth. You're going to get heaven. You're going to get all that stuff after you die. But in that intermediate space, that early Christian era, you had the apocalypticism of the book of Revelation. Don't worry, this is all going to be over. As many people have pointed out, the number of the beast is the Kabbalic number of the Emperor Nero, who was in the process of persecuting the shit out of the Christians when the book of Revelation was being written. And so that early apocalypticism is the yearning for that coming to blows. Now, of course, what ends up happening is individual Christians die, and they are either affirmed in their faith or they aren't. One way or another, we don't get to know. We just keep going. And the faith of our community is what maintains our faith. That is the most important part, is that it is a community of believers. And it is the actions of believers that reinforce the truth. And that is why early martyrdom is so important. So then Christianity becomes the state religion of the Roman Empire, because the old justifications for power were losing their power. They were literally waning in their ability to command the minds of men. And way too many people at the base, and this is the important part, so many people at the base of this system were embracing this new religion. It had to be dealt with, and it got past the point where it could be persecuted away. So it had to be absorbed into the system. And so that means that the apocalypticism of Christianity gets repressed, but only temporarily. And I think that you can chart in the history of Christianity and post-Christianity, like Western secularism is just a type of Christianity, in that it is the moral system of Christianity robbed of the supernatural, robbed of the narrative that held it together. The stuff that was really only able to be believed by the center of gravity of the population because of ignorance. So throughout that whole history, so you're talking, I would say, the rise of the medieval Christian church after, you got the fall and everything. I'm talking about in Western Europe, not the Byzantines. They got their own thing going on, but in the West, after the fall of Rome, you had this tumult, this process of Christianity sort of spreading across pagan Europe and conquering. And one of the things that helped make that happen was the fact that the bureaucracy of the Roman Empire, which was varied and deep and a powerful social technology, didn't just completely collapse with the Roman Empire. Those guys, those people still had their skills. They still had their relationships. They didn't just all decide to go farm, because who the fuck would do that? I mean, so civilization exists to avoid farming. Like, that's what it started off. Civilization starts off as a survival mechanism, a way to keep the group together in the face of changing climactic conditions and outside forces, and eventually becomes a social, religious world, a shared universe premised on the idea of avoiding having to farm. The thing that makes this all possible, which is also the most tedious and unfree experience you can have as a human. Because you are literally wedded to the land. And in doing it, you're doing manual labor, which is monotonous, repetitious, and physically painful. And you got to do it in all the weather. So those guys don't just go back farming. They become the bureaucracy of the emergent church. And they begin a top-down war, basically, on the folk beliefs of European peoples, barbarians, basically. And, of course, former Roman subjects, who by that point had largely been Christianized, though. And they were it started usually with rulers who were forced to convert as conditions of military defeat, or chose to convert in order to trade and make deals. And then missionaries and civic enforcement turns folk paganism into Christianity. And that is what the early church is. It is a fusion of this apocalyptic cult of universal humanity that, of course, is in the structure now of a state-supporting institution, being fused to the very particular, grounded, non-universal cosmology of European paganism. And you can very easily, it can be very truly said that, like, the Western Roman emperor was replaced by the Pope. He had basically the same job. And you might say, well, he had vastly less temporal power than the Roman emperors, but if you take it not as this point where Roman power collapses, but as a point where it transitions, it's a natural withering away of power. And in the process of sort of protecting itself, it built up the church built up these civic institutions, like the Holy Roman Empire, like all the royal houses. These hierarchies of power from amongst the European tribal population, sanctified now by this Christian God. That creates a fundamental schizophrenia at the heart of Christianity that expresses itself in periodic, punctuated periods of apocalyptic fervor. And that is the history of Christianity from the Middle Ages to the present, is this imperial ideology, this ideology that exists to keep people slaving for others, to keep exploitation and domination at the heart of human relationships, but also tells people that all are brothers, that they are part of a community of believers, that demands a relationship to the world around them that, if was followed by everybody the way that a community of believers you'd think would not have domination, would not have war, would not have sin as it was understood, it would not have misery. Like, we all believe in Christ, and yet there is war. We all believe in Christ, and yet there is misery and suffering caused by Christians committed against other Christians. How? How is this possible? And that contradiction fuels periodic upsurges of apocalyptic fervor, which are then violently expressed through revolts and military actions and every other sort of just physical violence pushed outward and inward, somewhere to take this energy. And then after that extinguishes itself and power remains, or power has been transformed by it, a order is reestablished for a while until it erupts. So in Europe, the first big one is, unsurprisingly, around the millennium. Christ was supposed to bring back, like literally, like when Christ checks out, he basically says to the apocalypse, to the apostles, to everyone reading, he says, "You guys hang tight. I'll be right back." That's it. That's what people thought. It's been 1,000 years. And we finally got to the point around the turn of the millennium where you have sufficient buildup of civic structures, like kinghoods and feudal structures that have like, real powerful day-to-day legitimacy. And therefore you have people who are within them and finding them wanting and horrible. And what this leads to is this explosion of you see this explosion of fervor as people lose their patience, basically, as they say, as they look at the world and find evidence that it's going to happen soon and I will be saved by it. And then, of course, the question becomes, what can I do to bring it about? And the big result of the first big like millennial apocalyptic mania is that it could be channeled by secular powers and by the papacy towards the sort of proto-imperial project of the Crusades. Hey, we got all these riled up fucking peasants and restless second sons of the nobility. What do we do about them? We'll send them to reclaim the Holy Land. Surely that will bring about the end of the world. Surely Christ's Jerusalem, the holy city, being reclaimed for Christ will bring him back. And so, a bunch of fucking guys marched halfway across Europe at the behest of a fucking hobo preacher, slaughtering Jews as they went, of course, because that's another big component of millenniary Christianity, and went and amazingly took back Jerusalem. Which really is genuinely shocking when you think about how ramshackle and unorganized the First Crusade was. But it was because they caught the Arabs looking, really. Like they were in the middle of one of their periodic conflicts over the caliphate, and they were all fighting each other. But this was not the only place where that apocalypticism manifested itself. You had in Europe, you had the Cathars, who rejected the idea that Christ had been resurrected. They denied the humanity of God, of Christ. and they ended up being the subject of their own crusade, and they got slaughtered. In fact, it was during the massacre of the Cathars that the cardinal overseeing the battle said, "Kill them all, God will know his own." And it was because the Cathars tried to live in common. They tried to bring about that eschaton by actually living as Christians, which could not be allowed. And then you've got the real apocalypse that these people were waiting for and fighting for and struggling in the Middle East for. They actually finally got it in the 14th century, and it was the Black Death. It was the fucking Black Death. Half the population of Europe destroyed. Feudalism, otherwise known as the world as they knew it, genuinely destroyed. What came after the Black Death is a feudalism in transition and crisis, basically the second it establishes itself. And so you have this this period where, because of the huge number of deaths and because of how much land that freed up, because feudalism before the Black Death had reached a final, like a real material stalemate. It was in a situation where there could be no more improvement under feudalism's conditions of agriculture, because you had this pure peasant-based system where there was no there was no incentive, there was no coercive technology to make people improve their land. There was nothing, there was no social reality, there was no social structure, human or market-based or religiously inspired, to make people produce enough fucking food to do this sort of population revolution necessary to build a technological society, or to even allow feudalism to continue under its own conditions. Like, it could not even maintain itself because there just wasn't enough left to feed every fucking fourth-born noble. There wasn't enough land to give to all those people, you know, because they kept reproducing themselves. And the church was a big part of where that excess noble population would go. Not everybody can inherit the castle and the manor. The ecclesiastical hierarchy was a place for those second and third born aristocratic sons to also hold power and wealth. There was nowhere for them to go, and the conditions of agriculture couldn't allow for it either. And the Black Death came, knocked the whole thing over, wiped out so many people that agricultural labor became much scarcer, but the amount of land much expanded, and that gave everybody the freedom to move. Like, literally, it greased the skids. It allowed rural peasants to negotiate better conditions under which they worked, better rents from landlords, better obligations to their feudal lords. And land itself was easier to come by and could be parceled out one way or the other, or purchased. And that creates this social scramble. All of this, of course, while we're all supposed to be Christians, we're all Christians here, and yet we are fucking murdering one another and scamming one another to get it over on each other in this new, more fluid social order. And this is when you see the real explosion of urban population in Europe. And you have also a very warm century after the Black Death that leads to bumper fucking crops, that leads to a century of very, a century of wildly successful agricultural yields and harvests, without anybody having to change the way that they farmed, just because the conditions were better. And so you had this huge explosion of population and this huge move of populations into cities. And remember, everybody's supposed to be a Christian this whole time. And then around 1500, people start to get antsy again. In part because there is a line in the Bible about, the next generation and a half or something like that, which people took to mean 1,500 years after the birth of Christ. And this time, though, when everyone's getting antsy, and remember, since the Cathars, there have been the Lollards in England, and of course, most successfully, the Hussites in Bohemia, who were able to carve out their own ultraquist faith after battling the Holy Roman Empire to a standstill. And they, like Jan Hus was a proto-Luther. I mean, he did what Luther did too. They both published dissent from the Catholic Church. They both got called to a council with the Pope under a pledge that they will not be harmed, and then went in front of the Pope and said what they believed. The difference is that with Hus, they just said psych and burned him anyway. With Luther, Charles V let him go, and then I think with the assumption that they'd get him later, but then his patron abducted him in a phony kidnapping as he was leaving the Diet of Worms, and rescued him and made sure that by the time he got out of there, civic authority behind Lutheranism would be dominant in like parts of Europe, parts of Germany that he could live in. But anyway, so that's where you get the Reformation, because unlike those previous times, you have the printing press, and you have the rise of mass literacy, and you have the creation of new ways of thinking, literally new abstracted identity, a different mental landscape, one that is more interior than previous ones had been, one that is less validated and ratified by social life. It's in the head, literally. And the Reformation explodes out of that. And the Reformation is a process to bring about that apocalypse, which everyone assumed was going to happen. And that's why the Protestants were so carefree about shredding a social fabric that had been like fundamental, like was a load-bearing structure of society, without anything to replace it, because they thought they didn't need to replace it. They thought that them, by moving towards righteousness, they would create heaven on earth one way or another. Either Jesus will return, revelation will occur, or if you were the smaller groups like the Mennonites and the what later became the Amish, and of course most spectacularly the Anabaptists of Munster, attempts to live communally, to bring the eschaton, to emmenitize the eschaton yourself. And Luther and the more conservative Protestants said no, because they liked where they were. They liked their position as comfortable, well-fed, and Luther was well fucking fed. The fucking Reformation did his tummy favors. Like if you look at paintings of the young Luther, and then after he got married and had been writing for like 10 years or so, that dude chonked up. He married an ex-nun who was a great cook, and he'd just sit around and just scarf all day long sitting at the fire. Of course he has no reason to see the social order destroyed. So when a religiously inspired peasants' revolt occurs in 1822, in 1522, he denounces it. He says, no, that's not what we mean. But this cycle is driven by the fundamental schizophrenia. Like, we are supposed to be in a Christian brotherhood, and yet we all act like this. Now, the thing that kept it day to day, the glue together in the medieval era, is the social ritual. It is mass. It is communion. It is all those sacraments. It is those actions. It is those socially affirmed activities that happen no matter what. And it is, in Northern Europe anyway, the concept of purgatory. The idea that nobody's in hell, so you don't have to worry about that. Like that is one of the big things that I think drove early Protestant social mania, is the fact that these guys convinced themselves that they were going to go to hell when nobody else really thought that before them. Regular people did not worry about going to hell, because if they went to church and they got communion once every year or whatever, and they confessed to the friar, they wouldn't go to hell. Now, they might go to purgatory, roast on a spit for a while, but it's temporary. And your family, while you're dead, can do something to speed along your redemption. Protestantism created a world with the same physical miseries and exploitations and suffering and alienations that had existed under the papacy, but removed that social salve that was reinforced by all of those sacraments. Makes everybody freaked the fuck out. It makes everybody anxious. And of course, this is a context now when just around the same time that people start thinking the world is ending, that warm period ends. And while people fight over religion for the course of the 15th century, this warm period is slowly ending. So you have 2 centuries of this religious war that is, I mean, in the minds of the people fighting it is religious, even though it's, of course, not. It's there too. It's power. Power by one group or another. That's what is driving the whole thing always. But with the mask of this religious idea that has to be synthesized, that has to be reconciled. And that is what everyone is doing with their violence and their posts and their witch burnings, is they're trying to reconcile that. And I would argue that the secular modernity is the ongoing process culturally, like in terms of why people interact, why people consciously interact with the system, not why they're doing it, why they're actually doing it, what the story they tell themselves, the cultural world that they create, is an attempt to reconcile that notion. Universal ethical principles, the promise of a world beyond misery, in a world where we are all brothers, in that we all believe the same thing and therefore act accordingly. Because you can't really believe in Christianity at the top of the totem pole that we have. You have to have what you think in your head is Christianity, but is actually Satan worship. You have inverted, if you're at the top of the totem pole of power, anywhere near the top of the totem pole of power in a Christian world, you have to turn for your own deeper material interests, which you can't even interrogate. You have to transmogrify ritually Christianity into Satanism. And it's been that Satanism that has driven the ship of state under capitalism since its inception. Because what capitalism was the apocalyptic synthesis of these at the level of the material. The apocalyptic synthesis of these things is always destruction, is annihilation, imaginatively, right? Because this cannot be resolved, and therefore we must be destroyed. Like we can either, if we cannot have this resolved, we will be destroyed. That's why we put it off into the other world, That's why we imagine it's heaven. But of course, since we killed God in the 19th century, it has not been heaven for a long time. Nobody really believes in heaven in the West. Not in this. What I mean by that is that they don't believe in it enough to not allow the miseries of living under a system of domination, either as an oppressor or as the oppressed. They don't believe it enough to stop that from twisting them towards selfishness, twisting them away from their instinctive understanding of unity, and therefore their faith in God, their faith that, yes, when you die, it's fine. It's not scary. It doesn't hurt. And it ends in the thing that heaven was always supposed to end in, reunion with God. It's there. It's there for everybody. That is the gospel, and it's true regardless of whatever religion you believe. It is fundamentally a fact. We all go to heaven. Because what are you really scared of? You're scared of fantasy, of losing control of your illusory ego construction, and it's physical extensions into the world. And if you really believe that, you wouldn't do bad shit. I mean, exploit people if you're in power, but also take out your frustration and your misery of being oppressed on other people if you're on the other end of the boot. That knowledge would sustain you. You'd be able to live at peace. None of us can do that because we don't believe in anything anymore. So that means that we can only follow the algorithm of capitalism towards its apotheosis, which is to, yes, change the world, to fundamentally alter the world the way that the Christians said it would be. But the twist here is, because this has been programmed by a satanic Christianity, it's not creating heaven. It's creating the other one. It's creating hell. We're literally creating, I hate to say it, a geo-hell. But the reason that book's title sticks with me 5 years later is because it's perfect. Whatever else you want to say about him or about the book, the name Geo-Hell is perfect because it perfectly describes what capitalism creates. And in religious terms, which is necessary. Because as I was saying, Christianity at the spiritual level, at the level of like belief in an afterlife, has a fundamental crisis of self-awareness that starts with the Reformation, that ends with the triumph of the Enlightenment in the 19th century. And over that process, public faith is extinguished. And it is, but the whole time that's happening, the whole time public faith is being extinguished, it is being extinguished by the rise of capitalism. The emergence of capitalism as a dominant social form literally wipes Christianity, public faith, out of existence and replaces it with faith in the market. And the way and this happens because, as I said, fundamental crisis of capital of the mind of society, of Western European society, right? Starting with the Reformation, as I said, cannot be resolved. Well, it has to be resolved at the material level, right? Because people still have to keep doing things. But if religion isn't going to get them to do the things, religion isn't going to get them to man the spots they need to be in the circulatory machinery that creates like the economy, that creates cultures, the civilization, broadly speaking. If you're not going to get them to do it because of a narrative they've told themselves about a place other than Earth, then you have to tell them a story about their reality here. You have to bring them closer to the grindstone. And the way you do that is by abstracting out of the realm of agency, human activity, the compulsive mechanism of economy, the compulsive mechanism of social control. To take the stick, right, and take the stick that is held by religion, right? Because it's carrot and stick to get you to do things. The carrot and stick are both held by the hand of the state in the form of the sword of the lord and or of the landlord, of the baron, of the count, of the aristocrat, and the cross of the priest. That's the carrot and stick. But you cannot. But the carrot doesn't work if the stick is too deeply felt, because then you realize this cannot be a Christian world I live in. What capitalism does to solve that problem, without anybody knowing that's what's happening. Everybody else is fighting for their own self-interest, cloaked in social beliefs. The combination of identity, motivating identity elements, the things within them that make them do things, which are things like personal self-interest, but are not just that. They're also self-conception. And that self-conception is socially generated. So that's why you can't just say that there's naked self-interest, because someone's self-interest isn't just what their body wants in some abstract sense. What want is socially defined. Not entirely, but partially. Like being hungry is not socially defined, but feeling like you're a Christian or that you have honor, those are socially defined, and they mean things to people. That's the important part. So they're all fighting for their self-interest in those terms. And they destroy Europe in the 15th and 1600s doing this. And meanwhile, in little old England, off in the corner, they're building a new social order where the carrot is still there in the form of the direct relationship you have with, the awareness you have of the positives of living in a society, right? Because you have to have most people being like, well, this is better than living in the forest. Because at this point, that's a real option. So you have to have a thing that keeps people rooted. And what it is, look, this suck, but these are okay. I got a roof over my head, I have food, I have relative safety. Because the alternative is less of those things. So that carrot is still there in the hand of this state broadly confined, the secular state. But the stick of, if you don't do this, you will be, the stick of the stuff that I produce with my sweat, I don't get to consume, somebody else does, and they get to order me around, and they make me fight on behalf of them. All of that stuff, over time, becomes marketized. We can no longer assign blame in our own heads without even aware of it. Ideologically, we are no longer blaming the social order, our fellow citizens, people, for for the bad things in our life. We are now blaming this new secularized God. Now, at first, it was actually God, like those Puritan freaks who kickstarted capitalism in England. They wanted to build this natural mechanism for determining God's favor because they were successful members of the burgeoning capitalist merchant class. They were invested in the new capitalist order, but they still believed. They still believed in God. They still believed in Christianity as they understood it, which still was in deep conflict with the world that they saw around them. And since they had given up the idea of reforming God on earth, reforming the ones who gave up on the idea of reforming God's kingdom and making it come into accord with God's lordly world that will bring about apocalypse. In Europe, they went to do it in America. And eventually some of them did it in Europe too with the English Civil War. But the English Civil War ended with not the apocalypse. They cut the king's head off. Surely that's going to bring it about. Didn't happen. All you had was bad harvests and feuds and just the same old bullshit, which is why they ended up bringing in back the Stuarts and then finally had a leveraged buyout with the other big merchant republic of that era, or the other merchant the other like advanced merchant society of the time, which is the Netherlands, and bring in finally the William of Orange to preside over this new social structure, this new constitutional monarchical system, where that royal prerogative that was grounded in genuine religious belief in his placement at the top of a godly hierarchy is replaced by the self-interest of a bunch of paper pushers in London. And they get to determine what's going on, not the fucking king. The king just has to watch it all happen. And what they do is they overtake the whole world. And slowly over time, that godly world that the Puritans thought they were going to build in New England is turned into another commercial operation. And the domination that was supposed to be absent creeps in. And eventually, the ritual reaffirmation of our belief that is necessary for us to hold God in our hearts, because faith is not rational, you know? If rationality is the only language you speak in, if abstraction is the only language you speak, because you have lost the social reaffirming rituals of faith, because if it's not rational, it's felt, and it is not felt alone, not by us anyway. It could have been in past instances felt alone, but for us, it can only really be felt in those emotional moments of human interaction and human connection. Because what we're feeling when we feel unity, when we feel connection, is a deep and fundamental truth. It's as true as anything. It is the truth it's the beautiful truth that Keats talked about. And as I said, it is our ultimate salvation. It's the fact that we are, every single one of us, going to be reunited. And in being reunited, we will understand. And the anxiety of loss of our fictional identity is soothed. To the degree that we understand, it can be soothed. Or is that Byron? I don't know. One of those opium smoking freaks. But it can't be articulated. We lose it in symbols. Because symbols are instruments of differentiation. It's ways of us to define things down from totality. So that means that there is a fundamental latency in every interaction, every symbolic exchange of information. We lose, with every symbolic reduction, meaning. And by the time we get it out to ourselves, it is now an abstraction that has to be reaffirmed. It cannot be held in the mind. And then when we try to communicate it to others, we lose even more. And that is why that's why it is silly to talk about religion being good or bad. Religion is the basis of human human self-conception. Like, we are all, at the end of the day, God. In that, we preside over a mental universe that is all-encompassing and total and cannot be penetrated. That's why we all freak out about the idea of death, because it is literally the end of the universe. But we are all that at the same time. And our understanding of that universe is not ours. It is made by every other person and by every other thing. It has no independent existence. That is illusory. And that illusion, the harder we hold it, the more we are pulled away from our understanding, and the more scared we get. And the more of the time we have on Earth we're going to spend in some state of anxiety and fear that is only going to get stronger as we get closer to actual death. And then that means that our death itself will be far more painful and scary. Scary more important than painful, because the pain is always absorbable by the body. It is how it's understood afterwards. And that is the fear. The fear at the other end is it, but that also is temporary. And that truth exists no matter what. And religion is just the attempt by people trapped in time and space with certain symbolic languages to find a symbolic order, a structure of symbols that other people can understand, so that they understand that the thing you're thinking of is what they're thinking of. You know? The feeling that you're describing is the feeling that they're describing. And that means that with that locked in, with that understanding in place, you can act to that person in a way that is free of fear. You're not going to be afraid that they're going to take something from you. You're going to be able to trust them. Like Nazis love to freak out about high trust and low trust societies, and they think that it's racially based. No, it is as everything generated by the relationship of domination. It falls along racial lines first because when we're trying to get to that state of love of another person, where there is no fear, there's a degree of instinctive understanding. And racial caste in America is this stark symbolic reality that imposes on all of us and makes it much harder for us to conceptually cross the chasm. But it's universal. Like, lack of trust is the solvent of all systems of domination, but certainly one in decay, and certainly one like Catholicism or capitalism that is premised on this, as I said, suicidal destruction of the universe or the earth that will create this segregated hell on earth, where people are shattered into full isolation from one another, psychically and technologically, while the earth itself is literally burned. And the thing that is pushing against that, the thing that came into being in the mid-19th century that Karl Marx was at the birth of and therefore could express, was the secular expression of that Western religious impulse. If there is no heaven, which we now all are slowly realizing, no heaven that we can sustain and believe in enough in a day-to-day basis to give us solace, well, then we have to do something about the world we live in, so that we can spend the time we have on this planet as pleasurably as possible, and pleasurable in the Epicurean sense, not at the expense of others, which all pleasure is under systems of domination, but mutual, loving pleasure, which is in our capacity. What other struggle is there other than that? And that's the engine of socialism. That is the religious basis of socialism. And of course, that's what's so stupid when people say wokeness is a religion. No shit, everything is a religion. It's just that now, because faith has departed us, we only have the structures, and those structures connected to an idea of political struggle that replaces the spiritual struggle. And so we seek to make that real. Now, at the height of the labor movement, the thing that was really motivating it was not the abstract desire of these post-religious aesthetes, which we all are now, to make the world a better place as an act of self-actualization. Those people are overwhelmingly prevalent at the top of left-wing and socialist movements because of their superior access to technology of rule, of education. If the battle to wield power in a literate society is based on the ability to bring together people, then communication is one of the most important abilities to have. And that is something that is parceled out only at the top of the economic structure by design. Those people are providing theory, and they're being leadership. They're certainly prevalent to be found in the political class. But the real engine of the thing is the self-interest of workers whose lives suck, who do not experience domination as guilt. They experience it as the rage of the exploited. And they say, hey, if there's no heaven, then Jesus fucking Christ, can I get a few more days off to spend with my family? For the love of fucking Christ. And it was those two forces that pushed and every society, every post-industrial society of the West, towards some reckoning with its economic order. And then what you see in World War II is after capitalism enters like deep crisis, like European capitalism, which is to say world capitalism at that point, basically, that them plus the U.S. and like Argentina. And maybe Japan. Is in like it comes to a fundamental crisis, like another moment of apocalypse, but this time it is much more materially driven, in the sense that you've now got a point where you're no longer operating by human will, you're operating by the machine logic of capitalism, which means that it overproduces and then destroys resources within a fixed system to the point where it can no longer distribute. It can no longer relieve social pressures as they build within it. It can no longer soothe the mechanism. It's no longer oiled. What oils it is imperialism, but it wasn't moving fast enough for all of the rapidly exacerbating social conflicts that are arising out of this misery that is being imposed. The ripping away of the serfs and peasants from their land, which is their subsistence, their understanding of the world. The ripping away of artisanal autonomy from urban laborers. Hell, ripping away the authority of kings. Because this whole time, all these compromises are being made, all these forces are being unleashed by lords to keep their power. Meanwhile, they're losing it bit and bit and have to accede to the loss in order to defeat all the other, in order to maintain their battle, to be able to prevent being defeated by the other competing European powers. And so you have an explosion. And in the aftermath of that explosion of World War I, you have a religious battle within the top half, the middle half of the middle of the top half of the exploiter caste, about whether there is a universal or there is only a particular. And communism was the idea of the universal, the pursuit of apocalypse through universality, and then there is Nazism, which is that pagan particularism, right? That Christianity got fused on top of. Fascism is its reemergence. Fascism is the reemergence of that pagan particularism that had been synthesized by feudalism, and then had been essentially bought off by capitalism, but then was coming into, in the context of a depression, a secular decline in conditions that refuse the possibility of advancement in this world. You see the flight towards an apocalyptic conflict between particular and the universal. And the only reason it doesn't lead to the end of civilization is because there are other places that have synthesized their conflicts. And the United States, because of its free real estate and its slave economy, is able to offload so much of the actual miseries of building capitalism outside of the social world, the social reality, the universe as occupied by those people who actually build the thing, the farmers, the industrial laborers, the middle class. It means you have those same pressures, but they don't come to an apocalyptic head. And you have FDR as this figure who stands between them and synthesizes them. And then that synthesis of the European mind is stabilized by, now that the free real estate has been fully absorbed, by the creation of a world market after World War II. Oh, we're the only industrial power in the world left. There's an entire world to reshape. And we can be the powerhouse of the global economy. We will be where things are manufactured. We will be where things are consumed. We will pass things through like the circulatory system and be at both ends of the exchange and be able to distribute those resources and put aside these questions. And now we have reached another apocalyptic conflict within capitalism. You could argue that it started in the 1910s, and that this is just a continuation of it, the same way that the cycle that began with the Reformation didn't end until the Treaty of Westphalia. This is the same. We are in the same cycle that started with World War I and is now reaching another reckoning of some kind. But the difference is now there is no engine of oppression animating politics in the United States. There is only the neurotic world of the exploiter. There is only a civil war in the mind of the American middle class. And the rest of us are basically watching it. Even the actual economic decisions are not being made by people. Like even at the top of the food chain, they're watching it. Donald Trump watched his entire presidency. Joe Biden isn't even watching his presidency. He's sleeping in front of the TV. The decisions are being made algorithmically. Because that's what we did. We took civilization, a thing that was defined by a human endeavor where technology was used by humans towards certain ends, to a situation where civilization is technology using humans to its own encoded ends, which were put there by people, enthralled by this death cult, Western capitalist profit-seeking. Okay, does any of that make sense? And so that is why, if there is a future for I won't even say capitalism. I will say whatever techno-feudal order will replace capitalism under conditions of collapse, long-term slow collapse, like where I said, where it's a transition, where at the other end of it you don't have, there's no point where it's like, oh, this is the end of the world. You've turned around and all of a sudden you're in a different thing, but you never noticed as things shifted around you, which I think you could argue was how the Roman Empire fell. It was largely experienced by many people in it, not as some apocalyptic ending, but as a, hey, we don't get the mail anymore type of situation. But otherwise, the same life. And I think that's what you're going to see. It will not be headquartered here. It can't be. The United States, because it is captive to this mania, can only consume itself. That particularist and universal principle is, it cannot be resolved. So we will only destroy ourselves. If there's a place in the world where capitalism arrived late enough, you guys know where I'm getting with this, late enough and in a condition not of national domination, but of national exploitation, then their assimilation of capitalism, on top of their peasant communalism, their secular communalism, remember, because they don't have this big weight of spiritual ennui and existential angst that has to be addressed, because their religious traditions are more culturally reaffirmed. They're not abstractly reaffirmed. So that means, and so that's got to be, folks, we're talking about China. We're talking about China. And again, when I say that will be where it's headquartered, that doesn't mean means China is our saviors. It means that if we assume that the total and complete collapse of human institutions would be a bad thing and a setback, then the social structure that exists currently that will be most likely to bring that about will be China. It will not be us. And it will not be the working class. Now you can, honestly, imagining what that'll look like, what that surviving human civilization will look like, you might very well decide that collapse would be better. Like, because at least collapse gives you the chance for the people who emerge later to maybe be able to pick and choose from the rubble and not have the history of dead generations weighing on their head like a nightmare for eternity, which would be the case under any persistent regime. So that's why I think like the China savior question is, like many of these, silly. Because we're not talking about building communism. We're talking about maintaining human civilization. And honestly, I don't want to get people to think that I'm a super climate doomer anyway. I think that's more likely to happen, significantly more likely to happen, to the point that freaking out about it is probably beside the point. And even if it isn't, what are you going to do? Are you going to freak out, or are you going to figure out, you're going to make some accommodation with the world around you and then some reason to keep going and then do it? Now, that could be climate terrorism, but you have to ask yourself, is that something that feels like it's coming from a place of love, or does it feel like it's coming from a place of nihilistic hate? And if it's hate, then guess what? It's probably the wrong thing to do. You're probably doing it to feed your own political ego and to feed your own narcissistic need to be at the end of the world that we're all fighting against. But if China is able to do this, it'll be because the social order is capable of actually reprogramming the machine. They can organize amongst themselves sufficiently to intervene in the gears. Capitalism has mushed us, the way that it emerged, so much. The people who are in it at every level are so deeply ideologically conditioned to the point that even if they recognize the machine falling apart in front of them, the stuff they would do to fix it would only make it worse. That's what we're basically at now, because they don't know what to do. They only know the opposite of what to do, because they've been conditioned by the machine to do what the machine wants them to do, which is keep it going. So even there's no amount of things that can happen. There's no amount of signs of apocalypse that can emerge from our collapsing ecosystem that will get them at the top to do anything about it. Because anything that would actually do something about it is against their programming. It's like how RoboCop can't arrest Dick Jones. Holy shit, it is like that, isn't it? It's an exact parallel. That is capitalism. We are RoboCop. We are programmed. The difference is there's nobody to fire Dick Jones. Maybe there was in 1989. Now, Dick Jones is the machine. Dick Jones is the algorithm. So that means they can do everything in their power to stop the slide towards apocalypse, and they will only make it worse. I'd say that the hope that human institutions, again, if it's a hope, if it's a thing we should want, which I think is up in the air, and the real question we should ask ourselves, it'll be because the Chinese Communist Party, as a self-motivated group of humans who have an ideological understanding of themselves and their place in the world and what they want, can look at capitalism and actually do something to reduce its death drive, and to eventually replace all the parts within it that lead to that. But of course, as I said, all that does is get you to this new system that is post-capitalist. Because when I'm saying they're going in there to change things, I don't mean they're necessarily going in there to turn things socialist. And I think that's what a lot of people assume. They're going to turn things towards survival, towards necessity. And that is where the fact that they are a capitalist country and their structures are capitalist, their social relationships are capitalist, undermines them. Because at that point, what do we do about this? If you do not have active, powerful social forces pushing you in one direction, then the answer might not be socialism. It might be Techno-Feudalism, which we're already seeing exists in advanced, in imminent form, and we'll see it expanded. But the X factor in all of this is actual workers. Here, in China, everywhere, coming towards an understanding of themselves as political actors again. Not doing it through the structures that we have built and that we are captured by, all of us watching this, but through building new ones in the act of pursuing power. Not to soothe their fucked up American Protestant psyche, which is what all of us are doing, but to improve their lives. I only have so much time on this earth. I want to spend it loving. And I can't do that if I'm working 80 hours a week with psychos coughing in my face. I can't do it if I'm picking fucking shit out of a dumpster. I can't do it if I'm running for my life from a fucking climate tsunami. And what has to happen is that those individual pursuits of self-interest can come together. Now, this is the reason that I am so emphatically against the discourse as a place for people to put their political energy. Because I'm fully convinced, this is like my sacrament, this is my number one belief about politics, is that these social forms, symbols, language, structures that currently exist in our political realm, Democrat, Republican parties, and then the surrounding political formations and ideas around them, the left, the right, are fully detached from material conditions. And I mean fully. So that any attempt to organize workers that depends on them will be fatally undermined by the neurotics at the top, by the crooks and freaks at the top, by the self-interested predators and the neurotic Puritans at the top. But that doesn't mean that there is no place for action. Action goes at the level of the self. And self-interest. Self-interest defined collectively, not abstractions, not through abstractions, but through, what was I saying? That social ritual, the reaffirming action. We all want this thing for us individually, but working together will get it for all of us. That builds a social bond. And then the act of that pursuing that builds the need to extend to other people to increase the effectiveness of our action. And every interaction that struggle will have with our politics, our vocabulary of politics, our spectacle of politics, only serves to warp it. Because it introduces irrelevant shit. Because none of that stuff matters. Because all of those questions, at the end of the day, are questions that exist for people who are observing it as part of their ritual of self-absolution to find out if they're good or bad people. Am I elect or not? Let's check. I'm going to observe these people doing something and then pick a side. And then the other people telling me I'm right, the other people in my group that I've identified as right, agreeing with me, means that I'm a good person. And then I can tell them that publicly. This is all just the Puritans trying to build that private heaven that they can't really believe in through repeated and repeated public affirmations. Because they can't believe in it, because it's abstract, because it's not socially reinforced. That means that the structures, the cultural expressions, and the political machinery that is made by that struggle will not involve any of those people, any of that vocabulary. And that means it will not be part of the Democratic Party, that's for fucking sure, or the fucking Republican Party. Good fucking Christ. It will neither be Democrats nor Republicans. It might not be any party. A party might be part of it, like an actual, go up for elections, political party might be part of it, or not. It depends on the conditions. Like if the Democrats really do lose the ability to test for power at the national level, they will be in like a Whig-like death spiral. And it's amazing. They're in the process of allowing it to happen by not passing their package of voting reform shit. Which is what I mean when I say that in this system now, we are so ideologized that no one can act in their best interests in any sense. They see through this glass darkly. Like if U.S. hegemony is to be preserved, then capitalism has to be significantly reined in the near term. For American capitalism to be reined in the near term, you need the Democratic Party. I'm saying in the near term. Anybody who says the Democratic Party can be replaced tomorrow is an idiot. You're talking about a decades-long process. What I'm saying is, like, what people fantasized Biden would have been, or what people dreamed Bernie would have been. Like a real full-court press at the top of the political and cultural heights for conflict with capitalism. For that to happen, the Democratic Party has to be able to win an election because they're the ones on the ballot line. That is still where the that is where the vestigial loyalty of the working class qua class existed, and that cannot be denied. People can argue that it's been squandered in the past 30 years by the Democrats completely, but it is the only place where any vestigial loyalty along those lines lays. The Republicans have none, and that is why they're even more laughable a reservoir of this than elsewhere. Now, and again, what I'm saying is this is not going to happen. I have to very much stress. There will be no reckoning with capitalism from within the Democratic Party. I'm describing why there won't be. So that means that within this structure, it is in the best interest of Democrats, as Democrats, not as leftists, not as good people or bad people, as Democrats, to pass this shit quickly. But to do that, because of the margins, would require reforming the filibuster, undermining the individual power of individual senators. And these guys have been so ideologized that their understanding of their self-interest is narrowly their personal, most personal self-interest. And so they would rather allow the Democratic Party to lose the ability to compete for national power. And power, like actual power. Money comes from that. Like even if you're a total slimebag Democrat, money comes along with this. Losing the ability to fundraise, for God's sakes. But they're more committed to their individual power within the institution of the Senate. So they can't get it to happen. They can't make it happen. And then even if they did pass it, they wouldn't be able to use it. Because for the Democratic Party to do the thing I said, it would have to go head-to-head with its own donors, the people with actual power within it, at a time when its base is conditioned by them through media. The Democratic base is conditioned through the media to hate Republicans, hate and fear Republicans enough to do anything to avoid them to be in power, and also have an understanding of what's good, bad, what's smart, and what's dumb that is manufactured by the Democratic Party through its organs in the media. And that's why it's not going to be the U.S. But we're still here, and we still have to struggle, and we still have to give our lives meaning in the sense of we have to turn towards love, turn towards that deeper knowledge that we've been trying our entire life to articulate, that we are all connected, that we don't need to be so fucking scared of each other. We don't need to be scared of anything. We sure as shit don't need to have to be scared of losing a few creature comforts in our lives. I'm talking about the Democrats, idiot. This person's talking about Trump in 2006. It's completely different with the Republicans because they're not the vestigially working class party. They don't have to have the same internal checks that the Democrats have. Because Trump never threatened any of the prerogatives of the Republican Party. Dumbass. Sorry. But I'm specifically talking about the Republican Party, or Democratic Party. I just said all that stuff about love, and then I called the guy a dumbass for a earnest interaction. I'm very sorry. See, this is why. This is why you need a society that can reaffirm your best angels, because otherwise you are dominated by your satanic faith in your own individuality, because this is why I say all existence is religion. Your identity is not real. And this is why no one is more wrong than Ayn Rand, because her first premise is that you are real. Like your ego concept is a real thing. It's not. But that is what it is she describes there. What Ayn Rand is good for is that she describes what we have in capitalism instead of a spiritual morality. We have this secular morality, which says because there's nothing but this world, my experience, my sense perceptions throughout my life, the world I have in my head is the only thing, and therefore I am God, and therefore I am the only thing in the universe. And if you're the only thing in the universe, death is just a terrifying, non-conceivable thing. Death is this pit-of-your-stomach, nauseous terror. How can the world end? How? It's terrifying, and we have to do something with that terror. Well, if we're not going to confront it, because confronting it, the only way out is through. The only way to soothe that demon, to soothe that cold feeling, is to remember the deeper, real truth that you aren't real. You're not real. Now, your body is real. This stuff is real. Your life is happening. But you is this phantom, temporary structure that moves it around. And eventually, it will go somewhere else. That energy will go somewhere else. And your transition, this is the important part, your transition will be peaceful. Your transition will not be the horror, the mind-rending horror that you imagine it to be, because you're imagining it in life. You're imagining it on this side of the fucking curtain. You can only imagine it as terror turned into hellfire, turned imaginatively into an eternity in hell, because you cannot conceive of the end of this you. But if it is a transition, if you are transitioning into something else and it is experienced as a transition, then all that fear that you're having doesn't have to be, can be confronted. And if you confront it and neutralize it, then you don't need to do all the things that make us awful people. You don't need to do the things that we all think we need to do, and which collectively is what's going to destroy the world. Because we are all trying to find happiness through temporary assuaging of our existential anxiety. And the only way we can do that is by having fun, having a good time. And the only real way we can do that is by pursuit of material pleasure, which is, at this point, this late point in history, purchased on a market. And it is our actions on that market that keep everyone moving. That's the wind blowing through the fucking the wind chimes and making them move. Is the hole in everyone. The fear that we can only subsume. Now, there's also, of course, the misery of actual exploitation. Just feeling physical pain. Forget existential fear of death. Real, momentary fear of pain. It doesn't matter how much we believe in the world beyond, believe in our painless transition to a new phase where we will understand, where it will make sense. It's hard to believe that when you're in physical misery and where you're being compelled by some phantom market to do things against your will. Like, against your will. Slavery with extra steps, as old Rick and Morty said. And it is all of us collectively trying to avoid the real pain of life and the spiritual pain of feeling at the end of the day fear that this is all going away, and not peace and the knowledge that, no, you are going somewhere. And you're not going away. You are. And of course you might say, well, yeah, but like, what if you get a safe drop down your head? Because what I'm talking about is that if you have that peace, the amount of time you spent thinking that way, the amount of time alive you spend really in that mindset, it creates a world, because remember, we create the world. It creates a world that's different. It changes the world you live in. You no longer live. Okay, I gotta do this fast because I don't know how long I have. The world that I'm describing, where people operate out of that belief, where you have a community of people, a universal community where everybody believes in not a specific credo, but in that fundamental truth, but has access to advanced systems of technological economic management machine labor-saving devices. That is both post-scarcity communism as described by Marx and heaven as described by Christ. God damn it, did it do it again?